Welcome to Café Tales. I'm Alie, your host for today's Miss Marple adventure. We're joining Miss Jane Marple today in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead with the butter churn tragedy. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Pour yourself a proper cup of tea, keep your wits about you, and let's unravel this mystery together. The Butter Churn Tragedy Chapter 1. The Weight of Autumn. Schatzler. First hint of autumn had begun to touch the gardens of St. Mary Mead, though Miss Jane Marple reflected that it was perhaps more accurate to say that autumn had begun to whisper rather than speak. The late roses still bloomed with determined cheerfulness along her cottage fence, but there was something in the quality of the morning light that suggested the year was gently turning toward its close. She paused in her gardening to observe a particularly fine specimen of Rosa gallica, noting with satisfaction that her careful attention to the soil had yielded such abundant blooms. From her position beside the garden gate, Miss Marple had an excellent view of the main thoroughfare through the village, and she had developed over the years a keen appreciation for the rhythms of daily life that played out before her. This morning, however, the usual pattern seemed somewhat disrupted. There was an unusual bustle of activity surrounding the Stokes dairy farm, which lay just beyond the curve of the lane where it disappeared behind a stand of elm trees. Such preparation, she murmured to herself, carefully snipping a spent bloom. With her secateurs, the annual harvest fair is still a fortnight away, yet already the village seems to thrum with anticipation. Carts had been rolling past her gate since dawn, laden with the early fruits of the season, and she had observed no fewer than 3 separate conversations between villagers, who had stopped to examine the progress of various preparations. It was during one of these observations that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a figure walking along the lane with less than her usual brisk confidence. Mildred Stokes, the dairymaid who had worked at the farm since before the war, was making her way toward the village centre with her marketing basket. But there was something in her bearing that struck Miss Marple as peculiar. Where once Mildred had been quick to wave and exchange pleasantries with anyone she encountered, she now walked with her head down, seeming almost to wish herself invisible. Miss Marple had known Mildred for the better part of 15 years ever since the young woman had arrived from Little Wickham to work for Harold Stokes and his late wife. She had always been a cheerful soul, quick with a smile and generous with the extra cream that occasionally found its way into the baskets of elderly villagers who might appreciate such kindness. This new withdrawn manner was most unlike her. Church bells were striking 10:30 when Miss Marple decided that her roses had received sufficient attention for one morning. She gathered her gardening tools with the methodical precision that characterized all her domestic activities and made her way through the village toward the vicarage. The Reverend Leonard Clement was, she had discovered, an excellent source of information about the spiritual welfare of his parishioners, though he was perhaps not always aware of how much he revealed in his innocent observations. She found the vicar in his study, wrestling with what appeared to be a particularly challenging sermon. He looked up with evident relief when Mrs. Dane announced her arrival. "Miss Marple," he said, rising from his desk with genuine pleasure, "how delightful to see you. I was just pondering the theological implications of the harvest metaphor and finding myself rather tangled in agricultural terminology." "I'm sure you will find exactly the right words," Miss Marple replied with gentle encouragement. "The harvest does provide such rich material for contemplation, does it not? Speaking of which, I could not help but notice the preparations going forward for the fair. The village seems quite animated with activity." Indeed, the vicar agreed, settling back into his chair and gesturing for Miss Marple to take the comfortable seat beside the window. "Mrs. Peyton has been most energetic in her organization of the various committees, though, I must confess," he added, with a slight frown, "I have been somewhat puzzled by a request I received just yesterday." Miss Marple arranged her hands in her lap and waited with the patient attention that had served her so well over the years. "It was from Mildred Stokes," the vicar continued. "She came to ask if I might provide her with a new hymnal. Not an unusual request in itself, you understand, except that Mildred has never been what one might call a regular attendee at services. In fact, I cannot recall seeing her in church more than 6 times in all the years she has lived in the village." "How very interesting," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Perhaps she has experienced some sort of spiritual awakening." "One would hope so." "Naturally," the vicar replied, though his tone suggested some uncertainty. Yet there was something in her manner. She seemed rather distressed. When I asked if there was anything particular troubling her, she became quite flustered, and insisted that she simply wished to do what was right. Most curious phrasing, I thought. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The request reminded her rather strongly of her late cousin, Fanny, who had developed a sudden and intense interest in religious literature. Just before the family had discovered her involvement in a most unfortunate financial scandal involving the church building fund, people, she had observed, often turned to spiritual comfort when their consciences were particularly burdened. "I do hope," she said carefully, "that poor Mildred is not facing some difficulty. She has seemed rather subdued of late." "Not at all." Like her usual cheerful self, the vicar brightened at this observation. "Precisely my impression. I am so glad you have noticed it too. I had begun to wonder if I was imagining things. She has always been such a pleasant, forthcoming young woman." Miss Marple made several more gentle inquiries about the preparations for the fair and the general state of the parish, but her mind continued to return to the image of Mildred Stokes walking with such uncharacteristic withdrawal through the village streets. As she made her way home through the dappled sunlight that filtered through the elms, she found herself thinking that there were indeed shadows beginning to gather, and not all of them were cast by the changing season. The afternoon settled over St. Mary Mead with deceptive tranquility, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize that the most profound disturbances often announced themselves with the gentlest of whispers. Chapter 2. Death among the Churns. Morning of September 23rd dawned with that peculiar stillness that sometimes precedes unexpected events. Though Miss Marple, engaged in her customary assessment of the weather from her bedroom window, could not have anticipated just how dramatically the day would alter the peaceful rhythm of St. Mary Mead. The mist hung low over the village, lending an almost ethereal quality to the familiar landscape, and she noted with satisfaction that the forecast suggested ideal conditions for the final preparations of the harvest fair. She had just finished her morning tea, and was contemplating a visit to Mrs. Bantry when the sound of running footsteps on the lane caught her attention. Young Tommy Fletcher, the postmaster's son, was racing toward the village centre with a sort of desperate urgency that spoke of genuine emergency rather than boyish excitement. Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate care and moved to her front gate, where she was joined by several other villagers who had been similarly alerted by the commotion. "Whatever can be the matter?" inquired Mrs. Price from the cottage next door, her voice carrying that mixture of concern and curiosity that such moments invariably produced. The answer came within minutes as P.C. Edwards cycled past at considerable speed, his usually measured pace abandoned in favor of what could only be described as haste. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Mrs. Price, and without the need for discussion, both ladies found themselves walking in the direction of the Stokes dairy farm. They were not alone in this impulse. A small procession of villagers had formed, drawn by that peculiar magnetism that accompanies unexpected drama in small communities. The group moved with a sort of respectful concern that acknowledged something serious had occurred, though none could yet guess at its precise nature. The scene that greeted them at the dairy was one that would remain etched in the collective memory of St. Mary Mead for years to come. Dr. Haydock's motor car stood in the farmyard, and the good doctor himself could be seen in earnest consultation with P.C. Edwards beside the large stone building that housed the dairy operations. Harold Stokes stood somewhat apart from the official proceedings, his face bearing an expression of shocked bewilderment that seemed entirely genuine. Miss Marple positioned herself with careful discretion at a point where she could observe without appearing unduly inquisitive, a skill she had refined over many years of village life. From this vantage point, she was able to discern that the center of attention was the large butter churn that stood in the yard behind the dairy proper. "Dreadful business," murmured Dr. Haydock as he approached the gathered villagers, his professional demeanor clearly strained by the morning's events. "Poor Mildred appears to have suffered a most unfortunate accident." The words fell upon the assembled company with the weight of genuine tragedy. Miss Marple felt a sharp pang of distress, remembering her recent observations of the young woman's troubled demeanor. That she should meet such an end seemed particularly cruel, given the obvious burden she had been carrying in recent days. Mrs. Bantry, who had arrived with characteristic promptness upon hearing the news, moved to stand beside Miss Marple. "However did it happen?" she asked in a lowered voice. Dr. Haydock glanced toward the churn with evident reluctance. "It appears she was reaching into the churn perhaps to retrieve something and lost her footing. The churn is quite deep, you understand, and ... Once she fell in. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear enough. P.C. Edwards, having completed his initial examination, approached the group with the sort of official gravity that his position demanded. I shall need to ask that everyone keep well clear of the area, he announced. Inspector Slack has been summoned from Much Benham, and we must preserve the scene until his arrival. Miss Marple nodded her understanding, but not before her keen eyes had noted several details that struck her as worthy of particular attention. The churn itself bore signs of recent disturbance beyond what one might expect from normal use. The cream within had an odd, curdled appearance that seemed inconsistent with the careful standard she knew Mildred maintained. Most curious of all, there were muddy footprints around the base of the churn that appeared rather large for someone of Mildred's slight build. Such a tragedy, observed the vicar, who had arrived to offer what comfort he could to Harold Stokes, and so unexpected. Mildred was always so careful in her work. Harold Stokes lifted his head at these words, his expression one of profound grief. She was indeed, he said quietly. I cannot understand how such a thing could have happened. Mildred knew every inch of this dairy as well as her own cottage. Miss Marple found herself studying Harold's face with careful attention. There was genuine distress there, certainly, but something else as well. A quality she could not quite define, but which reminded her rather uncomfortably of a case she had once known where grief and guilt had become so intertwined as to be nearly indistinguishable. The arrival of Inspector Slack brought with it the familiar bustle of official investigation. The inspector, a man of decided opinions and limited patience for village concerns, made a rapid assessment of the scene before declaring his conclusions with characteristic firmness. Tragic accident, clearly, he announced after examining the churn and interviewing the principal witnesses. These old dairy implements can be treacherous, particularly for someone working alone. The young woman simply lost her footing and was unable to recover herself. Miss Marple observed the inspector's rapid dismissal of the scene with growing unease, while she had no desire to complicate what was undoubtedly a distressing situation. She could not ignore the various inconsistencies that continued to trouble her orderly mind. The torn fabric of Mildred's apron, the strange condition of the cream, the peculiar footprints. Each detail seemed to whisper of something more complex than a simple accident. That is, the official party began to disperse, and the villagers returned to their homes with heavy hearts. Miss Marple remained for a few moments longer, her thoughtful gaze fixed upon the dairy yard. The shadows were lengthening now, and the earlier mist had given way to afternoon sunshine. But she found herself thinking that some shadows were not so easily dispelled by the light of day. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been touched by tragedy, but Miss Marple's long experience had taught her to distinguish between the sorrows that came naturally and those that were made by human hands. Chapter 3. Currents. Beneath still waters, the news of Mildred Stokes's tragic death spread through St. Mary Mead with the particular velocity that attends shocking events in small communities. By the afternoon following the discovery, Miss Marple observed that the tragedy had become the singular topic of conversation wherever two or more villagers gathered. She had always found it instructive to study the various ways in which such news was received and discussed, for people's reactions often revealed as much about their own characters as about the circumstances themselves. Her first stop was the post office, that invaluable nerve centre of village intelligence, where Mrs. Pembroke presided over both the official postal business and the unofficial exchange of local information. Miss Marple arrived under the pretext of purchasing stamps, but her true purpose was to gauge the tenor of village sentiment regarding the tragedy. Such a dreadful shock, Mrs. Pembroke was saying to Mrs. Weatherby, who had arrived just before Miss Marple. Poor Mildred, and her so young, though I must say I had begun to wonder if something was troubling the dear girl. Miss Marple arranged her features into an expression of polite inquiry. Oh, how so, Mrs. Pembroke? The postmistress leaned forward with the confidential air of one who possessed significant information. Well, Miss Marple, it was the strangest thing. For the past month or so, Mildred had been receiving letters rather more than usual, if you take my meaning, and not the ordinary sort of correspondence either. These came in plain envelopes with no return direction, and the handwriting was most peculiar, rather cramped and careful, as if someone were trying to disguise their natural hand. How very curious, Miss Marple observed mildly. Did she seem distressed by these letters? Indeed she did. Mrs. Pembroke replied with evident satisfaction at having her observations confirmed. The first few times, she seemed merely puzzled, but lately, she would fairly snatch them from my hand and hurry away without her usual pleasant chat. Just last week, I remarked that she seemed quite pale, and she stammered something about difficult decisions before rushing off without another word. Mrs. Weatherby nodded sagely. I noticed it too. She used to be such a cheerful soul, always ready with a smile and a pleasant word. But recently, she seemed quite withdrawn. My Albert mentioned that she barely acknowledged him when he passed her on the lane, and you know how friendly she's always been to the young men of the village. Miss Marple filed away these observations with careful mental precision. The mysterious correspondence aligned troublingly well with Mildred's recent request for a hymnal, and her obvious spiritual distress. She made her purchases, and continued on her way, her mind turning over the implications of what she had learned. Her next destination was the Stokes farmhouse, where she intended to pay a proper condolence call. The Georgian brick building sat square and solid behind its well-maintained garden, presenting an aspect of prosperous respectability that had characterized the Stokes property for generations. Miss Marple approached the front door with the measured steps appropriate to such a solemn occasion. Harold Stokes received her in the front parlour, a room that bore the unmistakable imprint of careful feminine attention, despite the recent absence of a woman's hand. The furniture was arranged with mathematical precision. Every surface bore evidence of recent polishing, and the general atmosphere suggested a household maintained according to the highest standards of domestic excellence. "How very kind of you to call, Miss Marple," Harold said, gesturing toward a well-cushioned chair near the window. "I confess I am still quite overcome by the whole dreadful business." Miss Marple settled herself with the deliberate care of one accustomed to making the most of social opportunities. Harold Stokes was a man of perhaps 45 years, with the sort of solid, dependable appearance that inspired confidence in matters of business. Yet she could not help but notice a certain nervous energy in his manner, evidenced by a habit of consulting his pocket watch at frequent intervals, as if time itself had become a source of anxiety. "Such a terrible shock for you," she murmured sympathetically. "Mildred had been with your family for such a long time, had she not?" "Nearly 15 years, Harold replied, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "She came to us just after my dear wife and I were married, and she became quite indispensable to the operation of the dairy. Margaret, my wife, often said that Mildred was more like family than a servant." Miss Marple nodded understandingly. "She must have been a great comfort to you after your wife's passing. Such devoted service is increasingly rare in these changing times." "Indeed," Harold agreed, though she noticed he glanced once more at his watch. "I cannot imagine how I shall manage without her expertise. The dairy requires such careful attention, and Mildred understood every aspect of the work." As their conversation continued, Miss Marple found herself observing details that struck her as worthy of attention. The parlour, while immaculately maintained, showed signs of recent financial constraint. The carpet, though clean, bore the subtle markings of long use, and she noticed that several pieces of silver that might once have graced the sideboard were notably absent. Yet Harold's clothing was of excellent quality, and his watch, which he consulted with such frequency, appeared to be of considerable value. "I hope," she ventured delicately, "that the dairy business has not suffered too greatly from the various difficulties of recent years. So many enterprises have found the post-war period challenging." Harold's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. "Oh, we have managed quite well, thank you. The demand for quality dairy products remains strong, and we have been fortunate in maintaining our customer base." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and continued her gentle inquiries about the household arrangements and Mildred's duties. She learned that the young woman had been responsible not only for the actual dairy work, but also for much of the record-keeping and customer relations. It became clear that her loss would indeed represent a significant disruption to the farm's operations. As she prepared to take her leave, Miss Marple expressed her hope that Harold would not hesitate to call upon his neighbours for any assistance during this difficult period. His gratitude seemed genuine, though she noticed that his relief at her departure was perhaps more pronounced than strict courtesy might have warranted. Walking home through the lengthening afternoon shadows, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the various currents of information and emotion that seemed to flow beneath the surface of this tragedy. The mysterious letters, Mildred's obvious distress, Harold's nervous prosperity, despite apparent financial constraints, and the general sense that more lay hidden than had yet been revealed, all combined to create a pattern that her experienced mind recognized as significant. The village of St. Mary Mead had returned to its customary afternoon quiet, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the deepest waters often ran beneath the stillest surfaces, and that tragedy, once introduced into a community, rarely came alone. Chapter 4. What Lies Beneath. The morning after her conversation with Jenny, Morris brought with it one of those crisp September days that seemed to crystallize the very air, lending extraordinary clarity to both sight and thought. Miss Marple had risen early, drawn by an inexplicable restlessness that she had learned over the years to trust as a reliable indicator that her subconscious mind was working through problems her conscious thoughts had not yet fully grasped. She was engaged in the methodical task of deadheading her late roses, when she observed a slight figure making its way along the lane with the sort of furtive haste that immediately captured her attention. Jenny Morris, the young kitchen maid who occasionally assisted various households in the village, was clearly bound upon some errand that caused her considerable anxiety. Miss Marple had known Jenny since she was a child, and the girl's current demeanor struck her as most uncharacteristic. "Good morning, Jenny," Miss Marple called gently as the girl passed her gate. "You seem to be in quite a hurry this morning." Jenny started visibly and turned with the expression of someone caught in an act of questionable propriety. She was a pleasant-faced girl of perhaps 19 years, with the sort of honest countenance that made deception difficult and uncomfortable. "Oh, Miss Marple," she stammered, clearly flustered. "I was just that I needed to." Miss Marple set down her gardening shears and approached the gate with the unhurried movements that she had found most effective in encouraging confidences. "Perhaps you would care for a cup of tea. You look rather pale, my dear, and I was just thinking how pleasant it would be to have some company." The invitation, delivered with Miss Marple's particular combination of maternal concern and gentle authority, proved irresistible. Within minutes, Jenny found herself seated in Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room, a cup of properly brewed tea warming her hands, and the familiar domestic atmosphere working its calming influence upon her agitated spirits. "I suppose," Miss Marple observed conversationally, "that poor Mildred's death has been quite a shock to all the young people in the village. You helped her sometimes at the dairy, did you not?" Jenny's cup rattled against its saucer. "Yes, miss, when there was extra work or during the busy seasons. She was always very kind to me, was Mildred." "I am sure she was," Miss Marple replied warmly. "She seemed such a conscientious person. I imagine she took great pride in maintaining the dairy to the highest standards." "Oh, she did indeed." Jenny's response carried genuine enthusiasm. "Everything had to be just so. She always said the equipment kept spotless, the records properly maintained, and the storage areas organized to perfection. She spent ever so much time making sure everything was exactly as it should be." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Storage areas can be such a challenge to keep properly organized. I imagine the dairy has quite extensive storage facilities." "Yes, miss. There's the main dairy building, of course, but also the old cellar beneath. Mildred was always particular about that cellar, said it was the perfect temperature for certain processes and for keeping things that needed extra care." The information was delivered innocently enough, but Miss Marple's experienced ear detected a subtle hesitation in Jenny's voice. She waited with the patience that had served her well in countless similar situations, allowing the silence to work its peculiar magic. "Lately," Jenny continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "Mildred had been spending a great deal of time down in that cellar, more than usual. I mean, she said she was organizing the storage, making sure everything was properly arranged." But Miss Marple prompted gently when the girl's voice trailed away. "But," Jenny glanced around the sitting room as if ensuring they were truly alone. It seemed odd. The cellar was always perfectly organized, Mildred saw to that, and she seemed quite secretive about her work down there. When I offered to help, she said it wasn't necessary, that she could manage perfectly well on her own. Miss Marple refilled Jenny's cup with deliberate care, using the domestic ritual to maintain the atmosphere of casual conversation. "I suppose the cellar work must have been quite demanding. Did she mention what sort of organizing required such attention?" "That's just it, miss," Jenny replied, her anxiety clearly increasing. "When I asked, she became quite flustered, and said something about making sure everything was where it ought to be, and seeing that proper records were kept. But the strangest thing was, she paused again, and Miss Marple waited with exemplary patience. The strangest thing was that I heard voices down there one evening when I was leaving late. Not just Mildred's voice, but someone else's well. They were speaking quite low, but it sounded rather like an argument. When I mentioned it to Mildred the next day, she insisted I must have been mistaken, that she had been working alone. Miss Marple absorbed this information with careful attention to its implications. The pattern that was beginning to emerge reminded her rather strongly of a situation she had encountered years ago during the war, when certain villagers had found themselves involved in activities that required both secrecy and careful record-keeping. "I hope," she said carefully, "that Mildred was not allowing herself to become overtaxed by her responsibilities. Sometimes conscientious people take on burdens that prove too heavy for them to bear alone." Jenny nodded vigorously. "That's exactly what I thought, Miss." She seemed so worried about something in recent weeks, and there was one other thing. She hesitated, clearly struggling with the propriety of what she was about to reveal. The committee for the harvest fair had asked Mr. Stokes if they might use the dairy's cold cellar for storing some of the perishable items for the celebration. It would have been ever so convenient. The dairy has such excellent cold storage facilities, but Mr. Stokes refused quite firmly, saying the space was needed for dairy operations. Mildred seemed quite upset by his decision, though she tried to hide it. Miss Marple found this detail particularly interesting. In her experience, refusal to accommodate reasonable community requests often indicated circumstances that could not bear scrutiny. As Jenny prepared to leave, having been considerably calmed by the tea and conversation, Miss Marple walked with her to the gate. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sound of "Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple," Jenny said with genuine gratitude. "It has been such a comfort to talk with someone. I have been feeling quite troubled since poor Mildred's accident." Miss Marple watched the girl's retreating figure with thoughtful attention. The information she had gathered painted a picture of secrets and tensions that extended well beyond the simple tragedy of an accidental death. The cellar, with its perfect storage conditions and mysterious recent activity, seemed to occupy a central position in whatever drama had been unfolding in the days before Mildred's death. As she returned to her roses, Miss Marple found herself thinking that the most important discoveries were often made not by searching above ground, but by examining carefully what lay hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. Chapter 5. The threads begin to weave. The peculiar restlessness that had settled over Miss Marple following her conversation with Jenny Morris proved to be of the persistent variety that could only be remedied through direct observation. She had discovered over the years that her subconscious mind often recognized patterns before her conscious thoughts could articulate them, and the sensation of pieces waiting to be fitted together had become too pronounced to ignore. Thus it was that she found herself taking her morning constitutional at an unusually early hour, following a route that would afford her an unobtrusive view of the various comings and goings that characterized the daily rhythm of St. Mary Mead. The morning mist still clung to the hedges, lending an almost ethereal quality to the familiar landscape, and she walked with the measured pace of one who understood that patience and careful observation often yielded more valuable intelligence than direct inquiry. Her circuitous route eventually brought her to the vicinity of the village center, where she positioned herself with characteristic discretion at a point that commanded an excellent view of the main thoroughfare. From this vantage point, she was able to observe what struck her as a most unusual pattern of early morning activity. Mr. Forsyth, the manager of the local branch of Barclays Bank, emerged from the direction of the Stokes Dairy farm with the brisk stride of a man who had concluded satisfactory business. This in itself might not have warranted particular attention were it not for the fact that banking business was rarely conducted at farm premises before 8 o'clock in the morning. More intriguing still was his destination. Rather than proceeding directly to his chambers, he made his way to the residence of Mr. Peyton, the village solicitor. Miss Marple observed their subsequent consultation with the sort of keen interest that years of village life had taught her to apply to unusual patterns of behavior. The two gentlemen spoke with evident urgency, their manner suggesting matters of considerable importance that could not await the conventional hours of business. Their conference was brief but clearly significant, concluding with what appeared to be mutual satisfaction before they parted ways, with the purposeful efficiency of men who had reached important decisions. Miss Marple made careful mental note of the time and circumstances Adding this observation to the growing collection of details that seemed to center around the Stokes dairy, her attention was next drawn to Harold Stokes himself, who appeared in the village center with a bearing that struck her as remarkably confident for a man so recently bereaved. She observed him conducting what appeared to be routine business at the post office and the baker's shop, but his manner lacked the subdued quality one might expect from someone grappling with both personal loss and professional disruption. Most curious of all was a brief encounter she witnessed between Harold and young Dr. Haydock, who had emerged from his surgery to begin his morning rounds. Their conversation, while conducted in lowered voices, appeared to concern financial matters, and Miss Marple's trained eye detected Harold's gesture toward what appeared to be a considerable sum of money. "Rather unusual to see Harold about so early," observed Mrs. Price, who had appeared beside her with the sort of perfectly timed coincidence that characterized village life. "One might have expected him to remain rather more secluded, given the circumstances." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, he seems to be managing his affairs with remarkable efficiency. Perhaps necessity compels him to maintain his regular schedule despite his grief." "Possibly," Mrs. Price replied, though her tone suggested some skepticism, "though I could not help but notice that he seemed quite cheerful when he passed my cottage yesterday evening. Not at all the bearing of a man overwhelmed by tragedy and practical difficulties." This observation aligned uncomfortably well with Miss Marple's own growing sense that Harold's public presentation of grief-stricken bewilderment was perhaps not entirely consistent with his private circumstances. She filed away Mrs. Price's comment with the same careful attention she accorded all potentially significant intelligence. Her subsequent encounter with Dr. Haydock himself provided additional cause for reflection. The good doctor, having completed his early rounds, paused to exchange pleasantries about the unusually fine weather and the general health of the community. "I trust," Miss Marple ventured carefully, "that the various strains of recent days have not affected the general health of the village. Such tragedies often have far-reaching effects upon community well-being." Dr. Haydock considered her words with the thoughtful attention he brought to all medical matters. "Curiously enough, I have observed rather the opposite effect in at least one case. Harold Stokes, whom one might have expected to suffer from the combined effects of grief and increased responsibility, appears to be in remarkably robust health." "How fortunate for him," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Indeed," Dr. Haydock agreed, "and he has been most conscientious about settling his outstanding medical accounts. Paid in full this morning, as a matter of fact, tanned in cash, which is rather unusual for someone whose financial circumstances one might have expected to be strained by recent events." Miss Marple absorbed this information with careful attention to its implications. Harold's apparent financial resilience, when considered alongside the early morning consultations with the bank manager and solicitor, suggested circumstances considerably more complex than they appeared on the surface. The remainder of her walk provided additional observations that contributed to the emerging pattern. She noted increased activity around several prominent households, with various gentlemen conducting business at unusual hours and with an air of discretion that seemed inconsistent with ordinary commercial transactions. Most significantly, she observed that these same individuals, Mr. Forsyth, Mr. Pembroke, Peyton, and several others of similar standing in the community, had all, at various times during her morning constitutional, made their way to or from the vicinity of the Stokes dairy farm. The morning sun had burned away the early mist by the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, but her mind remained clouded with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve themselves. The pattern of behavior she had observed reminded her rather strongly of certain activities she had witnessed during the war years, when shortages and disruptions had created opportunities for those willing to operate outside the bounds of strict legality. As she settled into her morning routine of tending her garden, Miss Marple found herself thinking that the threads of this particular mystery were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern that was both familiar and troubling. The respectable surface of village life, she had learned, could sometimes conceal currents that ran considerably deeper and darker than casual observation might suggest. The peaceful atmosphere of St. Mary Mead continued to mask whatever drama was unfolding beneath its tranquil exterior, but Miss Marple's experienced eye had detected enough anomalies to convince her that the truth of Mildred's death lay hidden within a web of circumstances that extended far beyond the tragic accident it appeared to be. Chapter 6, Sacred Words. Secular sins. The accumulation of seemingly disparate observations had reached a point where Miss Marple felt compelled to pursue a line of inquiry that had been troubling her since her initial conversation with the vicar. The matter of Mildred's unusual request for a hymnal continued to present itself as a thread that, when properly followed, might lead to a more complete understanding of the circumstances surrounding her death. It was with this purpose in mind that Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage on the morning following her revealing constitutional. The October air carried the first genuine chill of autumn, and she walked with the measured pace of one who understood that important conversations should never appear hurried or overly purposeful. The Reverend Leonard Clement received her in his study with the warmth that characterized his dealings with all his parishioners, though Miss Marple detected in his manner a certain preoccupation that suggested he had been grappling with matters of some complexity. "Miss Marple," he said, rising from his desk where he had evidently been engaged in correspondence, "how delightful to see you. I trust you are well." "Quite well, thank you, Vicar," she replied, settling into the comfortable chair that he indicated. "I hope I am not intruding upon your preparations for Sunday's service." "Not at all," he assured her, though his glance toward the papers on his desk suggested that his morning's work had indeed been demanding. "I confess I have been finding it somewhat difficult to concentrate on sermonic matters. The tragedy of poor Mildred's death continues to weigh upon my mind." Miss Marple nodded with sympathetic understanding. "It has been a shock to the entire village. Such a conscientious young woman, and so devoted to her duties. I believe you mentioned that she had recently requested a hymnal." The vicar's expression grew thoughtful. "Indeed, and I have been reflecting upon that request with increasing concern. At the time, I was simply pleased that she appeared to be developing a greater interest in spiritual matters. But upon further consideration," he paused, and Miss Marple waited with the patience that had served her so well in countless similar circumstances. "Upon further consideration," he continued, "I believe there may have been more to her request than I initially understood. When I provided her with the hymnal she requested, she seemed almost reluctant to accept it as if she were being compelled by necessity rather than genuine religious awakening." Miss Marple found this observation particularly significant. Perhaps she was seeking spiritual guidance for some particular difficulty. "That was precisely my impression," the vicar replied, "and I am afraid I may have failed her in that regard. She seemed to wish to confide something of importance, but whenever I attempted to encourage her confidence, she would become quite agitated and insist that she must handle the matter herself." The vicar rose from his chair and moved to the window that overlooked the churchyard, his manner suggesting internal struggle. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might ask your opinion on a matter of some delicacy." "Certainly, Vicar," she replied, recognizing the tone that preceded significant revelations. "After Mildred's death, I felt it appropriate to return her personal effects to Harold Stokes. Among them was the hymnal she had requested. When I examined it before returning it, I discovered that she had been using it for purposes other than devotional reading." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though she maintained her expression of polite interest. "Indeed." The vicar returned to his desk and withdrew a leather-bound volume from one of the drawers. "I felt it proper to retain this temporarily, as I was uncertain how to proceed. Perhaps you might advise me." He opened the hymnal to reveal pages that had been carefully modified to serve as a repository for detailed written records. Between the printed verses and musical notations, Mildred had inscribed columns of dates, times, and sets of initials in a precise, careful hand. The entries appeared to span several weeks, creating a systematic record of what were clearly clandestine activities. Miss Marple examined the entries with the sort of methodical attention she brought to all potentially significant evidence. The dates corresponded roughly to the period during which Jenny Morris had observed Mildred's increased attention to the dairy cellar, and the times suggested nocturnal activities that would have escaped casual observation. "How very methodical," she observed quietly. "Poor Mildred appears to have been maintaining quite detailed records." The initials, when considered alongside Miss Marple's recent observations of unusual activity among certain prominent villagers, began to form a pattern that was both illuminating and deeply troubling. She recognized several combinations that corresponded to individuals she had observed conducting business with Harold Stokes under circumstances that had struck her as irregular. "The poor child," the vicar said softly. "I believe she was wrestling with a crisis of conscience. When she came to request the hymnal, She spoke of doing what was right, despite the potential consequences. I am afraid I encouraged her to follow her moral convictions without fully understanding the danger such a course might entail. Miss Marple continued her careful examination of the records, noting the precision with which Mildred had documented whatever activities she had discovered. The systematic nature of the entries suggested someone who understood the importance of maintaining accurate evidence, while hoping perhaps that such evidence would never need to be used. I believe, she said carefully, that Mildred may have found herself in possession of information that placed her in a most difficult position. These records suggest she was documenting activities that she felt were improper, while simultaneously struggling with the moral implications of exposing them. The vicar nodded gravely. That accords perfectly with my impression of her state of mind during our final conversation. She seemed to be seeking divine guidance for a decision that would affect not only herself, but others as well. Miss Marple closed the hymnal with gentle reverence for the courage it represented. Mildred had clearly recognized the potential consequences of her actions, while feeling compelled by conscience to proceed nonetheless. The young woman's request for spiritual guidance took on new significance when viewed in this context. "Victor," she said thoughtfully, "I believe Mildred was preparing to reveal something of considerable importance when her life was so tragically cut short. These records suggest she had discovered activities that troubled her conscience sufficiently to risk significant personal consequences. What do you believe we should do with this information?" the vicar asked, his concern evident in both voice and manner. Miss Marple considered the question with the careful attention it deserved. The hymnal represented evidence that could potentially illuminate the circumstances of Mildred's death, but it also contained information that would implicate several respected members of the community in activities that were clearly illegal. "I believe," she said finally, "that we must honor Mildred's courage by ensuring that her sacrifice was not in vain. However, we must also proceed with the sort of careful consideration that such serious matters demand." As Miss Marple made her way home through the increasingly crisp afternoon air, she carried with her not only the hymnal, but also a profound sense of the moral complexity that had ultimately cost Mildred her life. The young woman's attempt to reconcile her conscience with her circumstances had placed her in mortal danger, and Miss Marple felt a growing determination to see that justice was served, not only for the crime itself, but for the courage that had made its exposure possible. The peaceful streets of St. Mary Mead seemed to mock the darkness that lay hidden beneath their tranquil surface. But Miss Marple had learned that truth, however painful, possessed a power that could not be permanently suppressed by those who sought to profit from its concealment. Chapter 7. Into the Lion's Den. The weight of knowledge that Miss Marple now carried, following her examination of Mildred's hymnal, had reached the point where further observation alone would no longer suffice. She had long ago learned to recognize the moment when careful inquiry must give way to decisive action, particularly when the pursuit of justice demanded courage rather than mere prudence. It was with this understanding that she found herself contemplating a course of action that would, under ordinary circumstances, be considered both foolhardy and potentially perilous. The solution to her dilemma presented itself in the form of Mrs. Bantry, whom she encountered quite fortuitously while returning from her morning visit to the post office. Her old friend was engaged in animated discussion with the vicar regarding the arrangements for the upcoming harvest fair, but she immediately detected the subtle urgency in Miss Marple's manner that indicated matters of considerable importance. "Jane, my dear," Mrs. Bantry said after concluding her conversation with the Reverend Clement, "you have that particular expression that I have learned to associate with significant developments. Might I assume that your recent investigations have borne fruit?" Miss Marple glanced around the village street with the sort of careful attention that years of discreet inquiry had made habitual. "Indeed they have, Dolly. I wonder if you might have time for a rather important conversation. I find myself in need of both counsel and assistance." They made their way to Miss Marple's cottage, where the familiar comfort of her sitting room provided the appropriate setting for the sort of confidential discussion that the circumstances demanded. Over properly brewed tea, Miss Marple outlined the accumulation of evidence that had led to her current understanding of the situation surrounding Mildred's death. Mrs. Bantry listened with the sort of focused attention that she reserved for matters of genuine significance, her expression growing increasingly grave as the full scope of the criminal conspiracy became apparent. "Good heavens, Jane," she exclaimed when the recitation was complete. You mean to suggest that poor Mildred was murdered to prevent her from exposing this smuggling operation? I'm afraid that appears to be precisely the case, Miss Marple replied, and I believe the time has come to gather the final evidence necessary to ensure that justice is properly served. Mrs. Bantry set down her teacup with the deliberate care that accompanied serious decisions. What exactly do you propose to do? Miss Marple outlined her plan with the methodical precision that characterized her approach to all complex problems. A visit to the Stokes dairy ostensibly to offer continued condolences and assistance would provide the opportunity to examine the cellar facilities that had been the center of the illegal operations. The presence of two elderly ladies paying a proper social call would serve as both cover for the investigation and protection against any precipitous action on Harold's part. It is not without risk, Miss Marple acknowledged. However, I believe the evidence we might gather would be sufficient to ensure that Harold and his associates face proper justice for both their criminal activities and poor Mildred's murder. Mrs. Bantry considered the proposal with the sort of careful attention it deserved. I confess the prospect is rather daunting, but I cannot allow you to undertake such a venture alone. When shall we make this visit? This afternoon would be ideal, Miss Marple replied. Harold will be expecting continued expressions of sympathy, and our arrival during the normal hours for social calls will appear entirely natural. The intervening hours were spent in careful preparation for what both ladies understood might prove to be a confrontation, considerably more serious than their social facade would suggest. Miss Marple took the precaution of informing Inspector Slack of her suspicions, ensuring that official assistance would be available should the situation require intervention beyond their capabilities. They approached the Stokes farm in the early afternoon, walking with the measured pace appropriate to their purported mission of comfort and support. The October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the distant smoke of agricultural burning, creating an atmosphere of seasonal tranquility that seemed to mock the dark purpose of their visit. Harold received them with the sort of punctilious courtesy that their social positions demanded, though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected an underlying tension that had not been present during her previous visits. His manner suggested a man laboring under considerable strain despite his apparent efforts to maintain normal appearances. "How very thoughtful of you to call," he said, settling them in the front parlor with tea and the small ceremonies that such occasions required. "I confess the solitude has been rather difficult since poor Mildred's tragic accident." Miss Marple accepted her refreshment with the deliberate grace that proper etiquette demanded. "I can well imagine. The practical difficulties must be overwhelming. Mildred's knowledge of your operations was so extensive." "Indeed," Harold agreed, though his response lacked the grief-stricken quality that genuine bereavement would have produced. "However, I have been fortunate in receiving assistance from various quarters. The business need not suffer unduly." Mrs. Bantry, following their previously discussed strategy, expressed interest in viewing the dairy facilities themselves. "I have always wondered about the processes involved in producing such excellent dairy goods. Perhaps you might show us something of your operations." Harold's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated internal calculation. "Certainly," he said after a moment's pause, "though I fear the tour may prove rather mundane." Their inspection of the main dairy building proceeded with Harold providing the sort of detailed explanations that courtesy required. But Miss Marple noted several aspects of the facilities that seemed inconsistent with purely agricultural purposes. Certain equipment appeared unnecessarily sophisticated for simple dairy work, and the storage arrangements showed evidence of recent modifications that suggested uses beyond the preservation of milk and cream. Most significant was Harold's obvious reluctance to allow them access to the cellar storage areas. When Mrs. Bantry expressed particular interest in the cold storage facilities, Harold's explanations became increasingly evasive, and his nervous glances toward the cellar entrance confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about what lay beneath. "I believe," Miss Marple said with gentle firmness, "that a proper understanding of your operations would require examination of all the facilities. Mildred spoke so often of the excellence of your storage arrangements." Harold's composure began to show signs of strain. "The cellars are rather difficult to navigate for ladies of your that is. The stairs are quite steep and poorly lit." "How considerate of you to be concerned for our safety," Miss Marple replied. "However, I believe we are quite capable of managing a few steps." What they discovered in the cellar confirmed every suspicion that Miss Marple had developed. Hidden compartments contained clear evidence of smuggling activities, with traces of contraband goods and documentation that established the dairy as a distribution center for black market operations. The systematic nature of the enterprise was unmistakable, as was Harold's role as the central organizer. Harold's mask of grieving propriety finally cracked entirely when he realized the extent of their discovery. "I believe you have seen quite enough," he said, his voice carrying an openly threatening tone. "Perhaps it would be wise to conclude your visit immediately." Miss Marple regarded him with the calm assessment that years of dealing with human nature had perfected. "Indeed, we have seen precisely what we came to see. Poor Mildred's fate becomes quite clear when one understands what she discovered in this very cellar." Harold's expression darkened with barely controlled fury, but Miss Marple continued with unperturbed composure. "Fortunately, Inspector Slack has already been informed of our visit and expects our return within the hour. Any delay in our departure would naturally occasion immediate official inquiry." The confrontation that followed was brief but charged with menace. Harold's calculation of his remaining options was written clearly across his features, and Miss Marple could observe the moment when he realized that his position had become utterly untenable. As they made their way back toward the village under Harold's hostile surveillance, Miss Marple reflected that truth once properly revealed possessed a power that no amount of deception could permanently suppress. The final reckoning would soon follow, and justice would be served for both Mildred's courage and her tragic end. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The drawing room of Gossington Hall had witnessed many gatherings over the years, but few of such gravity as the one that assembled on the evening following Miss Marple's revelatory visit to the Stokes dairy. Mrs. Bantry had graciously offered her home as the venue for what promised to be the final act in a drama that had begun with what appeared to be a simple farm accident, but had revealed itself to be something far more sinister. Inspector Slack arrived punctually at 7. His usually brusque manner tempered by a grudging acknowledgement that Miss Marple's theories had proven more substantial than his initial dismissal had suggested. He was followed shortly by Harold Stokes, who entered the room with the bearing of a man who understood that his circumstances had become desperate, but who retained sufficient composure to maintain appearances. "I must confess," Inspector Slack began, settling his considerable bulk into one of Mrs. Bantry's more substantial chairs, "that I am still somewhat skeptical about these allegations. Harold Stokes is a respected member of this community, and the suggestion that he would murder his own employee seems rather extraordinary." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself in her customary chair near the window where the evening light provided optimal illumination for her knitting, looked up from her work with the mild expression that had served her so well over the years. "I quite understand your reluctance, Inspector," she said gently. "However, I believe the evidence will demonstrate that poor Mildred's death was neither accidental nor the result of any spontaneous violence, but rather the calculated action of a man who found himself facing exposure and ruin." Harold Stokes, who had remained standing near the fireplace with the air of a man prepared to defend himself against whatever accusations might follow, finally spoke. "Miss Marple, I cannot imagine what has led you to develop such extraordinary suspicions about my character and conduct." "Oh, but I think you can imagine it quite clearly," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking with steady rhythm. "You see, Harold, it all began with my observation of Mildred's changed behavior in the weeks before her death. She had become withdrawn and anxious, requesting a hymnal from the vicar, despite never having shown interest in regular church attendance." She paused to examine her work, giving the assembled company time to absorb this opening statement. "When I examined that hymnal after Mildred's death, I discovered that she had been using it to maintain detailed records of dates, times, and initials. The initials, I realized, corresponded to several prominent members of our community who had been conducting unusual business at your dairy during the early morning hours." Inspector Slack leaned forward with increasing interest. "What sort of business?" "Smuggling, Inspector. Harold had been using his dairy as a distribution center for black market goods, taking advantage of the legitimate cold storage facilities and the respectable facade of agricultural business to conceal a most profitable criminal enterprise." Harold's composure began to show signs of strain. "These are serious accusations, Miss Marple. I hope you have more than speculation to support them." "Indeed I do," she replied calmly. Yesterday's visit to your premises conducted under the perfectly innocent guise of a condolence call provided ample physical evidence of your operations, the modified storage areas, the sophisticated equipment inappropriate for simple dairy work, and the clear signs of systematic use for purposes well beyond the preservation of milk and cream. She looked up from her knitting to fix Harold with the sort of direct gaze that had unnerved countless individuals over the years. But the most damning evidence, Harold, was your own behavior, your financial prosperity despite the supposed struggles of the dairy business, your cash payments to Dr. Haydock, your early morning meetings with Mr. Forsyth and Mr. Peyton, and your confident plans for expansion despite having just lost your most experienced employee. Inspector Slack had been taking notes with increasing rapidity, and you believe Mildred Stokes discovered these activities. I believe poor Mildred stumbled upon the smuggling operation quite by accident, Miss Marple continued. Her natural conscientiousness led her to spend considerable time in the cellar, ostensibly organizing storage, but actually observing activities that troubled her moral sensibilities. The records in the hymnal demonstrate that she had been documenting what she witnessed, clearly intending to expose the criminal enterprise. Harold's mask of injured innocence was beginning to slip noticeably. Even if such activities were taking place, that hardly proves I would resort to murder. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded him with the sort of patient attention she might have given a particularly slow child. But Harold, you had invested considerable time and effort in establishing your operation. The profits were substantial, as evidenced by your mysterious financial recovery. When Mildred threatened to expose everything, you faced not only the loss of your criminal income, but also the prospect of imprisonment. For a man in your position, murder must have seemed the only viable solution. She rose from her chair and moved to the small table where the physical evidence had been arranged. The torn apron, the curdled cream, and the oversized footprints around the butter churn all indicated that Mildred's death was not the simple accident it appeared to be. She was murdered during a confrontation in which you attempted to retrieve the evidence she had been gathering. Then her body was placed in the churn to create the appearance of accidental death. Inspector Slack had ceased taking notes and was now studying Harold's face with professional interest. The man's composure had deteriorated markedly during Miss Marple's exposition, and his guilt was becoming increasingly apparent. The irony, Miss Marple continued softly, is that Mildred's request for the hymnal represented her attempt to seek spiritual guidance about her moral dilemma. She was trying to do what was right despite the personal cost. Her courage ultimately cost her life. Harold Stokes's remaining defenses finally crumbled entirely. The weight of accumulated evidence, combined with Miss Marple's inexorable logic, had made continued denial impossible. His confession, when it came, was delivered with the flat resignation of a man who had recognized the futility of further deception. Inspector Slack's subsequent arrest proceeded with the sort of efficient professionalism that such moments required, though Miss Marple noted that even the inspector seemed sobered by the revelation that such darkness could lurk beneath the peaceful surface of village life. As the various participants in the evening's drama departed into the autumn night, Miss Marple remained for a few moments in Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room, contemplating the pattern of events that had led to this resolution. Poor Mildred's courage in attempting to expose wrongdoing had ultimately been vindicated, though at a cost that seemed almost unbearable to contemplate. The village of St. Mary Mead would return to its customary tranquility, but Miss Marple understood that the memory of this tragedy would serve as a reminder that human nature in all its complexity remained the most challenging mystery of all. Justice had been served, but the price of that justice would long be remembered by those who had witnessed its terrible necessity. The evening air carried the scent of autumn fires and the promise of winter's approach, but Miss Marple found herself thinking that some seasons of the heart could never be fully left behind, no matter how completely the calendar might turn. Thanks for joining us for the butter churn tragedy. Did you suspect Harold Stokes was using his dairy for smuggling before Miss Marple revealed the evidence hidden in Mildred's hymnal? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this investigation with Miss Marple, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Miss Marple's wisdom. Human nature remains constant across all villages and cities, and the most dangerous criminals are often those who hide behind the mask of respectability. Is Alie, signing off from Café Tales.